Story number 1. The Whispering Shadows. It was 2009 when I moved into the old farmhouse. Nestled on the edge of a quiet town in rural Maine, it had been vacant for nearly a decade, and the price was too good to pass up. The locals always spoke about it in hushed tones, too eerie, too isolated, they'd say. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. I quickly became familiar with the creaky floors and the constant, unsettling drafts, but it was the sounds that first began to gnaw at my nerves. At night, as I would drift off to sleep, I'd hear what seemed like faint whispers, soft as if carried on the wind. Sometimes it felt like someone was walking just outside my door, but when I opened it, there was nothing there. A month passed, and I tried to chalk it up to the house settling, but then I began noticing small things. A window that was open when I knew it had been shut, the strange flicker of lights in the hallway, even when the power was off. One evening, as I sat on the couch reading, I saw something in the corner of my eye, a shadow, shifting. It darted out of sight as soon as I turned my head. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. The air in the house became cold, no matter how high I turned up the thermostat. I found myself checking over my shoulder more frequently, my pulse quickening whenever I was alone. I called a local historian hoping to learn about the house's past, thinking maybe I could ease my growing anxiety. He arrived the next day and asked me a lot of questions about the house, about how I was feeling. Then he told me something chilling. This place, it's been empty for so long. You know, this house was built on land where the old families lived. And a few decades ago, a man and his daughter died here. A house fire. The whole place went up in flames, but they never found the body of the girl. Some say she's still here. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but something in his voice made me shiver. As the sun dipped below the horizon that night, I decided to stay up late, determined to confront whatever was haunting me. The clock ticked past midnight. I was in the living room trying to read when the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the staircase. A chill ran through my body as I reached the top. The air was dense, oppressive. I glanced down the hallway where the shadows seemed to twist unnaturally, and then I saw her. At the far end of the hall, the faint outline of a girl stood, her back to me. She was small, dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned nightgown, and her hair hung in messy strands around her face. I froze, unable to move, as her head slowly turned toward me. Her eyes were empty, black sockets, and a chilling smile spread across her face. The whispers grew into a cacophony, all at once, echoing in my ears. "Come closer. Come see us." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. And then the girl took a step forward, another, and another, until she was standing right in front of me. Her face was now inches from mine, her cold breath swirling around my face. The whispering stopped. Everything was silent. In that moment, I understood. She wasn't alone. The shadows behind her moved, and I could feel the presence of others. Hundreds of them, all watching, waiting. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the freezing air. I never went back inside that house. The authorities later found that the fire that claimed the lives of the father and daughter had been no accident, and the house was condemned. But some nights when I'm alone, I can still hear the faintest whispers on the wind, calling me back to the shadows. I never told anyone about what I saw that night, but I know what I felt. And I'll never forget the girl with the empty eyes. Story number 2. The Watcher in the Window. It happened a few years ago in a small town in the Midwest. My name is Sarah, and I was living alone in a house I'd recently inherited from my grandmother. The house was old, creaky floorboards, antique furniture, and a yard that was more overgrown than I was willing to admit. But it had a charm to it, even if it was a little spooky. I'd moved in at the end of winter, so the nights were still long and dark. I remember the first time I noticed the man in the window. It was late, and I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. The house had a huge bay window that overlooked the street, and on that night, the moonlight was bright, casting long shadows across the yard. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A shadow had moved in the window, just a blur in the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but saw nothing. The street was empty. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. Over the next few days, I saw it again. A figure, always in the same spot, standing motionless in the window. It was unnerving, but I told myself it was probably a neighbor passing by, someone's silhouette caught by the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the person was waiting for something, or someone. One evening, I decided to investigate. It was a Friday night, and I had the whole weekend ahead of me. The figure appeared again, standing in the exact same spot, right by the window. This time I grabbed my coat and went outside to get a better look. I walked around the side of the house, my footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass. When I reached the window, I looked up to see if I could spot anything inside. There was nothing. The room was dark, and the curtains were drawn tight. Confused and slightly unnerved, I decided to call it a night and went back inside, locking all the doors behind me. But as I sat on the couch trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, I saw it again, this time clearer than ever. The figure was not standing in the window. It was moving. I froze. The figure wasn't just in the window, it was pacing back and forth, its shadow casting erratic shapes across the curtains. It was tall, too tall to be anyone I recognized, and it was unmistakably human, but it moved in an unnatural way, too slow, too deliberate. My heart raced as I stood up and moved toward the window, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my feet were already carrying me. When I reached the bay window and looked out, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one outside, no one standing in the yard, no shadow, no figure, nothing. I rushed back to the window, the cold air stinging my face as I looked inside. And then, my blood ran cold. The figure was in the house. It was standing behind me, reflected in the glass of the window. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his eyes, those eyes were glowing faintly, watching me. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. The hairs on my neck stood up as I scanned the space. Nothing. The next few days were a blur of panic and sleepless nights. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't stay in the house without the feeling that something was wrong. I locked all the doors and windows, but every night I would wake up to the sound of someone moving outside, slow, deliberate footsteps pacing around the house. Then, one morning, I found something strange. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the front door, big, heavy prints that led directly to the window where I'd seen the figure. But the oddest thing? The footprints didn't leave the house. They simply disappeared. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. They checked the area and told me it was probably just someone playing a prank, but I knew better. Whoever, or whatever, was in the house with me wasn't human. The next week, I couldn't take it anymore. I left. I packed up my things and stayed with a friend for a while. When I returned, the house was eerily quiet. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I moved out for good and put the house up for sale. Before I left, I asked a local historian about the house. She told me it had once belonged to a man who had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. He was never found, but people said he'd been obsessed with the house's bay window, always staring out at something in the night. I never told anyone what really happened to me in that house. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was watching me is still out there, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it's still watching you. Story number 3. The Mirror's Whisper. Elena had always loved antiques. There was something captivating about holding a piece of history in her hands, feeling the echoes of lives long gone. So, when she found the ornate, full-length mirror at a small, dusty estate sale, she couldn't resist. Its frame was dark mahogany, carved with intricate floral patterns, and the glass, though slightly warped, gleamed invitingly. "This belonged to the last owner for decades," the elderly seller said with a hesitant smile. "It's unique." Elena didn't notice the flicker of apprehension in the woman's eyes. She handed over the cash, loaded the mirror into her car, and drove home, pleased with her find. That evening, she set the mirror against the wall in her bedroom. As she stood before it, she admired how it seemed to enhance the space, reflecting her tidy room with its soft golden lamplight. But something was off. The first night, Elena woke suddenly, her skin prickling. The room was dark and quiet, yet her eyes were drawn to the mirror. In the dim moonlight streaming through the window, she saw her reflection sitting up in bed, staring directly at her. Her breath caught. Her reflection shouldn't have been visible from that angle. She turned her head to look directly at the mirror, but her reflection didn't move. It smiled. Elena screamed, fumbling for the bedside lamp. The instant the light flickered on, her reflection was back to normal, mirroring her wide eyes and trembling hands. It was a dream, she whispered to herself, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The following days the unease grew. Out of the corner of her eye, Elena would catch glimpses of movement in the mirror that didn't match her own. Shadows flickering, a faint outline of something, or someone, standing just behind her. She covered the mirror with a sheet, but at night she'd hear faint whispers, soft and unintelligible, seeping from beneath the fabric. One evening, desperate to put an end to her growing paranoia, she decided to confront the mirror. She pulled the sheet off with a flourish and stood before it. "Show yourself!" she shouted, her voice trembling. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the glass began to ripple as if it were water. A figure emerged from the depths, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes and a gaping, bloodless smile. Her hands pressed against the inside of the glass, and Elena felt the air in the room grow heavy, oppressive. The woman's voice was a chilling whisper, barely audible. "You brought me home. I'm so grateful." Elena stumbled back, but the woman's reflection didn't retreat. Instead, it stepped closer, pushing against the barrier of the glass. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, and with a deafening shatter the woman emerged, dragging herself into Elena's world. The last thing Elena saw was her own reflection, smiling serenely, stepping into the mirror as if it had always belonged there. When the police arrived days later, they found the house empty. The mirror, strangely intact, stood in its place. If you looked closely, they said, you could see a figure trapped within, a woman pounding silently on the glass, her screams unheard by the world outside.